Chapter 1. The alarm was already too late when it sounded. On the frontier world of Keshtar, alarms always sounded too late. The system had been built for trade, not war. Long orbital lanes, open traffic corridors, and defense platforms calibrated for piracy and accidents, not extinction-level events. When the first warning ping reached planetary control, it was logged, queued, and routed through 3 separate authorization layers before anyone actually looked at it. By then, the sky was changing. Captain Irl Vass stood at the observation balcony of the planetary command spire, watching the upper atmosphere distort. At first it looked like heat shimmer, a subtle wavering in the blue-black edge of space. Then the stars began to bend. Not disappear. Bend. That was when she knew. "Confirm contact," she said, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. Technicians moved frantically behind her. Sensors screamed contradictions. Mass readings spiked and vanished. Gravitational shear tore through orbital telemetry as if reality itself couldn't decide what it was seeing. "Unknown vessels emerging," a sensor officer said. "No drive signatures, no jump wake. They're just here." Irl didn't ask how many. She already knew the answer would be wrong. The invaders did not announce themselves. They never did. They arrived in silence, enormous structures sliding into real space like ideas forced into a mind that wasn't ready for them. Their hulls were matte and uneven, not grown or forged in any recognizable way. They absorbed light instead of reflecting it, bending sensors around themselves until even looking directly at them felt like trying to remember a dream. The first orbital platform died without ever firing a shot. Its power systems shut down simultaneously, every redundant backup failing in the same instant. The platform drifted for 8 seconds before a focused pulse. Not energy, not matter, something else entirely sheared it cleanly in half. The halves didn't explode. They simply stopped existing. "Return fire," someone shouted. Weapons lit up the void. Plasma, kinetic rounds, coherent beams, everything Keshtar had. The shots vanished before impact, swallowed by fields that didn't deflect or absorb but erased interaction entirely. The invaders advanced. Irl's console populated with cascading loss reports. Stations. Ships. Civilian transports caught trying to flee along trade lanes that no longer existed. Every defensive model collapsed in seconds. "This isn't a raid," her second-in-command said quietly. "No," Irl replied. "This is a solution." She had studied enough galactic history to recognize the pattern. This was not conquest. There were no demands, no territorial claims, no attempt at occupation. This was removal. The invaders targeted infrastructure first: power grids, data relays, manufacturing centers. They ignored population clusters until evacuation became impossible, then erased those too with clinical detachment. Within 30 minutes, Keshtar was no longer a functioning world. Within 40, it was a memory. Irl ordered a retreat that saved exactly 1 ship, hers. The jump tore through unstable spacetime, alarms blaring as systems barely held together long enough to escape. When the stars snapped back into familiar patterns, she slumped in her command chair, hands shaking for the first time. The bridge was silent. No one spoke the question everyone was thinking. What follows something like that? The answer came 3 days later. Emergency councils assembled across the region as reports poured in. World after world vanished in the same way. No survivors, no debris, just absence where civilizations had been. The enemy was named quickly because naming was one of the few comforts left. They were called the Null Accord. Not because they identified themselves that way, but because every attempt to understand them ended in nothing. They communicated only through action. They did not respond to probes or signals. They did not adapt in visible ways. They simply continued. Coalitions formed. Fleets gathered. Plans were drafted and discarded. Every simulation ended the same way: total loss. That was when someone suggested it, not loudly, not confidently. A junior delegate, voice barely steady, said the words that shifted the room. "What about the humans?" The reaction was immediate and divided. Some scoffed, some went very still. Humans were not the strongest species, not the oldest, not the most technologically advanced. Their territory was modest by galactic standards, their politics notoriously fractured. But wherever humans had intervened in the past, the outcome was never clean. Wars ended without treaties. Enemies collapsed without final battles. Problems stopped existing in ways that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. "They're unpredictable," one admiral argued. "They're reckless," said another. "They don't respect escalation protocols." "That," Irl said, speaking for the first time since her arrival, "is exactly why they might matter." The room turned toward her. She met their gazes without flinching. "The null accord doesn't fight," she continued. "It removes. Every strategy we have assumes an enemy that wants something: territory, resources, control." She paused. "What if they do?" Silence followed. A transmission was drafted. It was not a demand. It was not a plea. It contained no promises, no threats, no leverage, only data. Sensor logs, battle recordings, absence maps, and a final line added after long debate: "If this can be stopped, we do not know how." The message was sent to Earth. For 12 hours there was no reply. Then a response arrived. It was short: "Received," nothing else. No mobilization signals, no fleet movements detected. 3 days later, a single human ship crossed the border into the war zone, unescorted, unarmed according to every scan. It did not head toward the front. It headed straight toward the space where Keshtar used to be. And for the first time since the null accord appeared, something unexpected happened. The erasure stopped. Chapter 2: The human ship did not slow as it approached the dead zone. Every other vessel that came near the remnants of Keshtar had done so cautiously, skirting the boundary where sensors failed and navigation degraded into guesswork. Beyond that invisible line, reality behaved badly. Signals looped. Distances lied. Objects that should have been visible simply were not. The human ship crossed the boundary without hesitation. From the command chamber of the emergency coalition station, Irl Vass watched the feeds with clenched hands. Every instrument screamed warning as the ship entered the region where the null accord had erased an entire world. Then, impossibly, the warnings quieted. Not vanished, not resolved, they stabilized. "Telemetry is coherent," a technician said slowly. "I don't understand how." No one did. The human vessel was small, angular, its hull unremarkable except for the fact that it seemed to refuse emphasis. It did not glow. It did not bristle with technology. It existed in a way that made the eye slide past it unless effort was applied. The null accord structures remained motionless around it. That alone was unprecedented. Every other ship that entered null space had been removed within seconds. No delay, no escalation, just absence. The human ship drifted, engines cold. Then it transmitted, not on open channels, not on military bands. It broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, using no encryption, no compression, no attempt to optimize signal strength. A simple carrier wave, a knock. Do they think they can talk to it? Someone whispered. Irl didn't answer. She was watching the null structures. They were reacting, not by moving, not by charging weapons, by reorienting. Sections of the mat constructs shifted subtly, like massive attention being redirected. Space around them warped, not violently but with deliberate precision. "They've noticed," Irl said. The human ship did not retreat. It sent another transmission. This one contained data, pure data. Raw sensor logs, observational records, no demands, no hypotheses, no requests, just evidence. The null accord did something no one had seen before. It paused. The erasure field that had been expanding steadily across the sector froze in place, not collapsed, not weakened, suspended. The coalition chamber erupted in noise. Analysts shouted. Commanders demanded explanations. Someone laughed, sharp and hysterical. Iryll felt none of it. Her attention was locked on the data overlay now appearing on secondary displays. The human transmission was being echoed back, not decoded, not replied to, but reflected. The null accord was processing it. They're not communicating, an analyst said. They're comparing. Comparing to what? The answer came slowly, horrifying in its implications. The null accord was not an empire. It was not a species. It was not even an intelligence in the sense the galaxy understood. It was a corrective system. An automated resolution mechanism embedded deep in spacetime, triggered when certain thresholds were crossed. Not population, not aggression, complexity. Civilizations that reached a level of interaction density, technological recursion, and spatial manipulation triggered the Accord's response. The system did not negotiate. It did not conquer. It simplified. "It's pruning reality," someone said softly. The human ship transmitted again. This time the data was different. Human history, not curated, not sanitized. Wars, collapses, near extinctions, environmental disasters, nuclear standoffs. Records of internal correction so violent it had nearly destroyed them. The null accord responded, not with movement, with recalibration. The erasure field contracted by a measurable margin. A system that had been scheduled for removal dropped off the projection. Alive, the chamber fell into stunned silence. "There, showing its scars," Iryll whispered. The human ship finally hailed the coalition station directly. A human face appeared on the main display. Older, tired, eyes sharp in a way that suggested nothing was wasted, not time, not attention, not restraint. "This thing," the human said calmly, "doesn't remove threats." He paused as if choosing the exact shape of the next words. "It removes unresolved systems." No one interrupted. "We've been unresolved for a very long time," he continued. "Messy, contradictory, full of feedback loops and bad decisions." A faint smile touched his mouth. "That seems to matter." "What are you doing?" Iryll asked. The human looked at her directly. "We're introducing ourselves," he said. "To what?" "To the mechanism that decides whether complexity deserves to exist." Behind him, unseen machinery hummed, not loudly, not powerfully, but persistently. The kind of sound made by systems designed to run forever without being noticed. The null accord structures shifted again. This time they moved away from the human ship, not retreating, making room. Iryll felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. The humans weren't fighting the null accord. They were being evaluated by it. And for reasons no one else yet understood, humanity had not been erased. Not because it was harmless, but because it was unfinished. Chapter 3, the evaluation did not end. That was the first thing the humans realized. The null accord did not issue verdicts. It did not announce decisions or escalate responses in ways that could be tracked with familiar metrics. It adjusted, quietly, incrementally, as if reality itself were testing assumptions and watching what survived the pressure. The human ship remained within the dead zone for 17 hours. No one aboard slept. The null structures continued their slow reorientation, not toward the ship but around it, rearranging spatial relationships with surgical care. Regions of space that had been hostile stabilized in its wake. Sensor coherence extended outward in expanding shells. Human presence was changing the environment, not forcefully, contextually. "This thing doesn't see us as an enemy," the human captain said over a secure channel, his voice steady but strained. "It sees us as a case study." Iryll Vass leaned closer to the display. "Then what happens when it finishes studying you?" A pause. Then it decides whether complexity like ours is self-correcting, he said, or whether it needs to be simplified. That word landed heavily. Across the coalition station, emergency councils reconvened, not to plan counterattacks or mobilizations, but to decide something far more unsettling, whether to interfere. Some commanders argued they should pull the human ship out immediately, that risking humanity in this way was irresponsible, even immoral. Others countered that withdrawing now might itself be a data point, one that proved complexity collapsed under pressure. The humans weighed in once. "Do not intervene," the captain said. "That would contaminate the test." "You're asking us to do nothing," an admiral snapped. "No," the human replied. "We're asking you to continue being yourselves." The null accord made its next move without warning. A distant system, uninhabited but rich in artificial constructs left behind by a long-dead civilization, was targeted. The erasure field advanced, slow and precise, collapsing megastructures that had stood for millions of years. The human ship transmitted again. This time it sent models. Not simulations of battle or resistance, but projections of consequence. Human-built predictive frameworks that did not optimize for efficiency but for resilience. Models that allowed for failure, redundancy, contradiction. The null accord hesitated. The erasure slowed. Then something unprecedented occurred. The accord reversed course. The field receded from the system it had begun to erase, not abandoned, deferred. A wave of disbelief rippled through the coalition station. "It changed its mind," someone whispered. "No," the human captain corrected gently. "It updated its criteria." The implications were staggering. The null accord was not enforcing a fixed rule of the universe. It was enforcing a preference, one that could be influenced by demonstrated behavior over time. And humanity, through sheer historical messiness, was shaping that preference. But the evaluation came at a cost. Within the dead zone, stresses mounted aboard the human ship. Systems experienced micro-failures that no diagnostic could fully explain. Time dilation effects began to desynchronize internal clocks. Crew members reported disorientation, memory lapses, emotional flattening. The accord was probing, testing limits. "Captain," one of his officers said quietly, "this thing is learning how close it can push us without breaking us." "Yes," the captain replied, "and we need to let it." Irl felt a surge of anger. "You're letting it hurt you." The human met her gaze through the screen. "We learned a long time ago," he said, "that showing weakness isn't the same as being weak. Systems that never admit strain don't adapt. They shatter." The null structures shifted again. This time they aligned, not with the human ship, but with one another. Vast regions of space folded inward as the accord reconfigured itself, incorporating new constraints into its operational logic. The erasure field stopped expanding entirely. Across the sector, worlds that had been days from removal stabilized. The red projections faded to amber, but the test was not over. The null accord had accepted humanity as evidence that unresolved complexity could self-regulate. Now it wanted to know something else, whether that complexity was contagious. A new target appeared on the projection. Not human, not Aurelian. A third civilization, dense, unified, optimized almost to perfection. The Accord's next candidate. The human captain's expression hardened. "They're asking us a question," he said. "What question?" Irl asked. "Whether we're an exception," he replied, "or an example." The human ship powered up subsystems that had remained dormant since arrival. Not weapons, not shields, communication frameworks, modeling engines, bridges. "We can't just save ourselves," the captain continued. "If we do, this thing will keep pruning everyone else." "Then what do you do?" Irl asked. The human's answer was immediate. "We teach," he said, "and we hope it learns faster than it erases." The null accord waited, not patiently, precisely. Chapter 4, Teaching the Universe, was not something humanity had ever planned for. It was something they had stumbled into again and again, whenever survival demanded explanations instead of resistance. Now, faced with the null accord's silent scrutiny, that instinct hardened into something deliberate. The human ship began broadcasting frameworks, not instructions, not commands, examples. They transmitted case studies of civilizations, human and otherwise, that had nearly collapsed under their own coherence. Models where centralized perfection produced brittle outcomes. Scenarios where uniformity amplified failure instead of containing it. The data was not optimized. That was intentional. Human frameworks included dead ends, unresolved contradictions, and ethical loops that never converged. They showed decision trees where outcomes were delayed because no single answer was acceptable. They showed systems that survived not by being right, but by refusing to finalize. The null accord processed it all, slowly, methodically. Meanwhile, the accord's next target, a civilization of crystalline beings known for flawless governance and zero internal dissent, began to destabilize. Their system did not yet face erasure, but the field brushed its outer reaches like a warning. The humans acted. They opened a channel to the crystalline civilization, bypassing coalition protocols entirely. "This is going to sound strange," the human captain said without preamble, "but you need to start arguing, immediately." The response was confusion, then offense. "We do not argue," the crystalline leader replied. "We resolve." "That's the problem," the human said. "You resolve too cleanly." The humans sent them data, compressed, urgent, on the null accord and its criteria, on how unresolved complexity appeared to delay or halt erasure, on how humanity's own contradictions had become evidence of resilience. "You want us to introduce inefficiency?" the crystalline asked. "I want you to introduce choice," the human replied, "even when it's uncomfortable." Time was short. The crystalline civilization did something radical. They fractured their governance, not violently, not chaotically. They introduced parallel decision bodies with overlapping authority. They allowed dissent to exist without immediate resolution. Policies diverged across regions. Art and philosophy, long dismissed as redundant, were encouraged. The null accord reacted. The erasure field slowed, then stopped. The crystalline system remained intact. Across the sector, similar interventions began, not coordinated, not uniform. Humanity did not centralize the response. They encouraged localized adaptation, knowing that diversity itself was part of the lesson. The null accord adjusted again. Its operational space reconfigured, incorporating new variables that had not existed before. Complexity was no longer a simple threshold. It had become conditional. The accord began skipping systems that showed signs of internal variance, even when they were technologically advanced. Dense, perfectly unified civilizations remained at risk. The universe, it seemed, preferred arguments to answers. The cost, however, was mounting. Aboard the human ship, crew fatigue deepened into something more dangerous. Neural strain accumulated as the accord's proximity distorted cognitive baselines. One crew member collapsed, consciousness flickering in and out as time desynchronized around them. The captain made a hard decision. He ordered the ship deeper into the dead zone. Ira watched in horror as the vessel crossed a boundary no probe had ever returned from. "Why would you do that?" she demanded. "Because," the human said, voice tight but resolute, "the best lessons are learned where the rules break." The null accord focused entirely on the human ship now. The erasure field contracted inward not to destroy it but to isolate it. Space folded. Metrics failed. The ship existed in a pocket of reality that refused to behave. The humans continued transmitting, not data now, principles. That resilience was not efficiency. That survival did not require harmony. That unresolved systems could adapt faster than perfect ones. The accord processed. Then, for the first time since its detection, it produced something that could only be described as a response. Not a message, a modification. The erasure field collapsed into a lattice, no longer a wave of removal, but a distributed presence that monitored without acting. The pruning function was rewritten. The null accord did not disappear. It changed its role. Instead of removing complexity, it began observing it, intervening only when systems demonstrated irreversible stagnation. The human ship emerged from the dead zone barely intact. Systems burned out, hull scarred, crew exhausted beyond anything recorded in human spaceflight history. But it emerged. Behind it, the dead zone dissolved into navigable space. The war, if it had ever truly been won, was over. But the consequences were just beginning. Across the galaxy, civilizations realized something profound and terrifying. The universe itself had been persuaded, not dominated, not defeated, persuaded. And the species that had done it was now drifting home, broken, tired, and already arguing internally about whether it had gone too far. Iro Vass watched the human ship vanish into jump space and felt a quiet certainty settle over her. Humanity had not saved the galaxy. They had complicated it, and somehow that had been enough. Chapter 5, The Galaxy Did Not Celebrate. There were no victory broadcasts, no shared moment of relief, no sudden unity forged by survival. That perhaps was the most telling sign that humanity's influence had taken hold. Civilizations that had narrowly escaped erasure did not rush to proclaim triumph. They hesitated. They argued. They disagreed about what had just happened and what it meant. The null accord remained. It no longer advanced as a blade sweeping across space, but it did not retreat into myth either. Its presence became something like pressure, a constant, invisible force embedded in the structure of reality. Systems learned to feel it the way organisms felt gravity. Not a threat exactly, a condition. For some civilizations, that knowledge was unbearable. They had been built on certainty, on optimized governance, unified purpose, the belief that perfection was both achievable and necessary. Those societies fractured under the weight of choice. Some collapsed inward, unable to tolerate dissent. Others simplified themselves voluntarily, abandoning complexity until they slipped beneath the accord's notice. Humanity did not interfere. They had already learned where interference ended and arrogance began. Captain Hale, his name finally entered the public record months after the incident, returned to Earth to no ceremony at all. His ship was impounded for analysis, then quietly dismantled. The crew dispersed back into civilian life, carrying neurological scars no one fully understood yet. Doctors asked questions that had no satisfying answers. Researchers argued over models that refused to stabilize. Politicians demanded assurances that could not be given. Humanity did what it always did when confronted with something too large to resolve. It argued. Factions formed immediately. Some claimed humanity had saved the galaxy and should formalize its role as intermediary between civilization and the universe itself. Others insisted the intervention had been reckless beyond measure, that rewriting a cosmic corrective system invited consequences no one could predict. Both sides were right. That, too, mattered. Iro Vass remained in coalition space for several years, helping coordinate the transition from emergency governance to something looser, more fragile, and paradoxically more durable. She watched as new alliances formed and dissolved without bloodshed, as councils splintered into networks, as cultures redefined success not as expansion but as persistence with room to change. Occasionally, she received messages from Earth, never official, never authoritative, questions, hypotheses, doubts. Humanity did not offer leadership. It offered conversation. The null accord intervened only once more in recorded history. A civilization on the far edge of mapped space, ancient, immense, and perfectly ordered, refused to change. Presented with evidence, warnings, and examples, they chose certainty. They tightened control, eliminated variance, and optimized themselves into something immaculate and silent. The accord simplified them. No one protested. The lesson was clear enough. Over time, the term human-style resilience entered academic and strategic language. It was never fully defined. Attempts to formalize it always failed because formalization missed the point. Human resilience was not a template. It was a habit, a refusal to let systems close completely, a tolerance for contradiction, a willingness to live with unfinished answers. Humanity did not thrive because it was strong. It survived because it never stopped revising itself. Years later, Captain Hale was asked, during a rare public symposium, whether he believed the null accord could one day turn against humanity again. He considered the question carefully. "Of course it could," he said. "We're not special." The audience waited. "But if it does," he continued, "it won't be because we're complex. It'll be because we stopped questioning ourselves." That answer unsettled more people than it comforted, which was, quietly, the point. The galaxy moved on. Slowly, unevenly, with more hesitation than before. Trade resumed, but without the old obsession with scale. Expansion continued, but rarely without internal debate. Civilizations learned to leave room inside themselves for disagreement, not because it was pleasant, but because it was safer. And somewhere, woven invisibly into the structure of reality, the null accord watched, not as an executioner, as a constraint, a reminder. The universe did not demand perfection. It demanded motion. Humanity returned to its endless internal disputes, to elections and protests and arguments over things that seemed absurdly small compared to cosmic erasure. They fought among themselves over values, priorities, futures. They never resolved those arguments. That was why they endured, not because they had spoken to the universe, but because they had convinced it that unfinished things were worth keeping.